Go to a facility because kids are a pain. My mother is no longer with me. You can call me Elaine Gray. I live in a 3-person household with my mother and father, and I am currently in the 5th grade of primary school. My father is very kind and frequently takes me on vacation. When my father is there, my mother behaves normally, but when he is not, she may be aloof and difficult to get along with. As usual, I'm off. Early in the morning, my father left for his job. It was at breakfast when I said, "Take care." It was nearly time to go for school, judging by the clock. I quickly finished my meal and changed into my new clothing. Thank you for the meal. When I was done, I returned to my room to change after washing the dishes in the sink. My mother phoned me back. "Just a moment," she said. She was pointing at the sink as I turned around. "Who is going to wash these?" She appeared irate, and her eyes were hard. Usually I would simply get dressed and head to school, but I was afraid of getting reprimanded for doing so. I answered, I'll wash them myself," in a quiet voice. Suddenly my mom screamed, "What?" "I'm unable to hear you." My body gave a start, but I felt wrong, so I said I was sorry. "I'm sorry, I'll wash them myself." "Hoon?" "Yes, exactly. From now on, take care of your own things." My mother returned to her room after throwing her apron onto the sofa in a fit of rage. After giving her statement some thought, I came to the conclusion that I had to handle things on my own. After breakfast, I cleaned up and went out. At school, the subject of parents came up in conversation with peers. Their mothers sounded nice when they listened to them, and despite their occasional outbursts, their relationships looked to be healthy. "What's your mom like, Elaine?" I was asked out of the blue, and I wasn't sure how to react. But I reasoned that perhaps I had misunderstood my mother's coldness, and that she was agitated because I had been ignoring my obligations. I responded by saying that she is really kind. "That's nice," my buddy said, but I wasn't sure how I felt. Upon arriving home and declaring, "I'm back," my mother was nowhere to be seen. I began working on my homework in my room, thinking she could have gone shopping. Before I knew it, the clock said it was dinner time, and it was pitch black outside. My mother had yet to come back, though. After some while, I heard sounds coming from the refrigerator and the entryway. I spotted my mother as I looked through the door of my room into the kitchen. I went to the kitchen, hungry, and said, "Welcome back," to her. "I'm back," she said succinctly. I could see she was still upset without looking back. "What's for dinner tonight?" I smiled as I inquired, but it appeared to be an error. My mother looked around, looking frightened. "What? I told you to look after your own belongings, didn't I?" Your dad will be home soon, and I'm busy preparing dinner." Just as my father arrived home, I grudgingly began to prepare instant noodles, since I was at a loss for words. "I'm home!" My mother quickly grabbed the instant noodles I was holding when she heard my father's voice. My father came into the kitchen when I was confused by what she was doing. "Oh, are we just starting dinner now?" When I saw my kind father's face, I started crying. "You're welcome back. I'm going to begin preparing dinner because today's shopping took a little longer. Please wait a little while longer, Elaine and Daddy." My mom's expression relaxed. The idea of eating the food she was cooking made me pleased, even if I wasn't sure whether she was no longer upset. My father and I enjoyed playing games together after our family supper. Perhaps my mom was still feeling a little down. As I slept off, I reasoned that I would no longer receive reprimands if I took good care of my belongings. I tried to take care of my own issues from the next day. After breakfast, I folded the clothes myself, cleaned the dishes, and stored them in the closet. On days when my mother was late, I made and consumed instant noodles by myself. I also cleaned my room. My face automatically brightened, hoping my mother would give me a compliment. She hasn't given me any praise yet, but she has been losing her temper less frequently. When my father is home, it's fun to spend time with him and the three of us as a family. I once recognized it was the middle of the night when I woke up to moaning noises. I wrapped my blanket about myself because I was afraid it may be a ghost. The moaning went on, and then I heard an ambulance siren, which made me shudder in terror. The front of the house started to make noise as the ambulance drew to a stop fairly near our house. I became aware that an ambulance had pulled up in front of our house for the first time. In a panic, I hurried out of bed to see that the paramedics were carrying out my father. "Daddy!" I screamed as I saw how pale and injured his face was. I sobbed while clinging to a paramedic and begging, "Please save my dad." With a kind touch on my shoulder, the paramedic murmured, "We'll take him to the hospital right away." After that, my father was sent to the treatment room at the hospital, where my mother and I rode in the ambulance. We had no choice but to wait at the assigned spot. My thoughts was consumed with dread while we waited, wondering what I would do if my father died. My mother was beside me, using her smartphone casually and without any visible symptoms of concern. I was crying, and I was waiting for someone to tell me that everything would be well. We don't know how long it took, but a doctor finally arrived. All I could comprehend while my mother and the doctor talked about something complicated was that my father had been diagnosed with a serious illness and would require some time in the hospital. The fact that my father had to battle this sickness broke my heart, even if the worst-case situation may have been prevented. I also had to come to terms with the fact that he would be out of town for a while. We made the decision to temporarily return home. After hurriedly getting everything ready for my father's hospital stay, my mother returned to the hospital. I laid in bed at home alone, unable to fall asleep. It quickly began to grow light outside because I had arrived home early in the morning. I need to go to school. My heart wasn't in it at all, but I knew I had to go to school. I lay still in bed since I was not hungry. "Aren't you going to school?" By the time my mother realized I hadn't left, it was midday. My mother didn't chastise me for missing school, but she had to leave the house quickly to go to the hospital. I went to the kitchen because I hadn't eaten since the morning. I prepared a supper using the leftovers from the previous night's dinner that was in the refrigerator and the rice that was still in the rice cooker. My mother had purchased some sandwiches for me when she got home in the evening. Savor this today. Additionally, I purchased some instant noodles. Please use those tomorrow. Thank you. I made the decision to do what my mother asked in order to avoid upsetting her because she was busy because of my father's predicament. I went to school the following morning after eating instant noodles for breakfast. I sidestepped the topic by claiming I wasn't feeling well when my pals questioned why I hadn't been there the day before. The teacher was friendly to me and appeared to understand my predicament. My mother was absent when I arrived home. She was most likely with my father in the hospital. I began working on my schoolwork after giving it some thought. I intended to ask my mother if we might go together on the next vacation since I also wanted to see my father. Since no one else was home, I chose to answer the phone when it called while I was working on my schoolwork. "Hello? Is that you, Elaine? What are you doing?" I started crying when I heard my father's voice on the other line. "How are you, Dad?" "I'd want to see you." My father smiled when he spoke to me while I was crying. "I apologize for causing you anxiety. The issue has been resolved. Dad would like to visit you. Mom and you should come see me." Yeah, I'll talk to Mom about it." "That's excellent. Is Mom with you, My father asked a question that confused me a little. I assumed Mom was in the hospital because she wasn't at home. I said, "Mom isn't here. Perhaps she's at the hospital." My father started talking in an indirect manner as if he had understood something. "Oh, I see. You're correct. I arrived home a little time ago. She should return shortly, I believe. Are you eating healthily, Elaine?" "Yeah. Mom bought some instant noodles for me, so I'm okay." My father remained silent for a moment after I spoke, and then he ended the conversation by saying, "I see." When my mom returned, I heard the front door open after speaking with my dad. When Mom arrived home, I gave her the phone since Dad had wanted to talk to her. Mom accepted the phone and spoke to Dad, looking a little disturbed. I wondered where Mom had gone before going back to her room, since I could smell tobacco on her when she got home. I asked Mom if we could go to the hospital together the next day, and she gave me a confused look before agreeing to take me. It had taken a while for me to see my father again. Even though he was hooked up to an IV, he smiled broadly when he saw me. "Elaine, I'm so glad you came." I hugged my father out of reflex, almost sobbing when I saw how pleased and energized he was. It was time for my mother to come back, so I left the hospital room after having a nice chat with my father. I turned to see my father smiling and waving his hand, saying, "Come visit again." I had no idea that this would be our final exchange of words. My father's health abruptly deteriorated, and he died shortly after. I went to the funeral wearing black as my mother had advised, since I couldn't accept the truth. At the funeral, a large crowd came to bid my father farewell. I nearly thought my father was still alive as I watched my mother, who remained calm the entire time. Someone came up to me while I was standing idly in a corner of the venue. "Hey, aren't you Elaine?" I turned around and found a woman standing there in a fairly extravagant outfit. The woman sat beside me and started talking, but I had no idea who she was. "Don't you think it's been a while? I am your aunt, the sister of your father." I could see the similarity to my father now that she had brought it up. My father had told me about his sister, but I was unaware of my aunt. "Aunt?" "Yes, aunt. Do you not think I resemble your dad?" She laughed as she spoke, and her features did resemble my father's quite a little. My aunt unexpectedly gave me a firm embrace at that very time. "It's acceptable to weep, Elaine." "You did a good job," she remarked. And my eyes started to well up with additional tears without my knowledge. I felt as though I had come to terms with the fact that I would never again see my father. I thanked my aunt and went to grab a drink after she gave me a gentle back rub, and I had calmed down a little. My mother was in the room with me, and when she saw my teary face, she said icily, "Were you crying?" How shameful. My heart was wounded by her icy remarks. "Are you not depressed, Mom?" Startled that she didn't appear to be mourning at all, I inquired. "Sadness won't make anything better. Now he's gone," my mother said icily. Her icy remarks caused my body to begin to shake. I questioned whether my mother had actually detested my father, even though the three of us had always laughed and enjoyed his company. My aunt showed up while I was still. "Oh, my sister-in-law, it's been a while." When my aunt stated it with a smile, my mother's face instantly transformed. "Yes, a long time has passed. Do you require assistance?" My mother said, "No, there's nothing," in response to my aunt's question. My aunt said, "Well then, Elaine, let's go over there." We walked out of the room when she grasped my hand. My mother's look made it clear to me that she was uneasy with my aunt. I then spent some time with my aunt, and the funeral went down without a hitch. After the funeral, my mother contacted me and said, "Elaine, we're leaving now." During the funeral, my aunt held my hand, but she released it when it was time to go. She had a rather dejected appearance. "See you again, Elaine." I said, "Yeah, see you," and went outside with my mother. There was a strange automobile parked there. My mom unlocked the vehicle door and apologized for keeping you waiting. I had an innate reluctance to get into the car since the driver was a stranger. In a voice I had never heard from my mother before, she pleaded, "Don't hesitate, get in quickly." I climbed into the car reluctantly, and it began to drive away from our house. I kept looking out the window, unsure of our destination. I was a little scared in the car. We're present. I was advised to go immediately. When I stepped out of the automobile, I saw a big building that I had never seen before. Where are we, Mom? As my mother smoked a cigarette, I inquired. She said, "Go to a facility. Kids are a nuisance." I was so stunned that all I could say was, "Huh?" As the man and my mother departed in the vehicle, I rushed after the automobile frantically, but I ultimately stumbled and couldn't keep up, so I had to stop. An automobile drew up next to me as I was making my way back to where I had been left. My aunt was seated in the driver's seat when the window slid down. I never thought things would go this way. Come on, get in, Elaine. I hurried inside the car, relieved to see my aunt once more. She gave me a head pat, and I began to cry silently in return for her generosity. You poor creature. How many times are you going to cry today? We drove for a bit before coming to what appeared to be my aunt's house. The words "welcome back" were spoken by a man as we walked in. My aunt chuckled and comforted me. It's okay. Even though I reflexively huddled behind her, a young man was standing there grinning kindly at me as I nervously glanced at the individual. I apologize for it. He smiled amiably and held out his hand, saying, "Actually, you can call me Uncle because I'm this lady's husband." I shook his hand in relief, and he grinned once again. "I assume you're hungry. Dinner is prepared. You must develop your strength and eat healthily." He jokingly said, "You're as picky as a mother." I laughed at their light-hearted conversation, and then my stomach rumbled. They both laughed even harder as I flushed with shame. After missing a wonderful mealtime for a long time, I was pleased to have it again. They prepared a bath and put out pajamas for me to change into after supper. My aunt had made some hot milk as I entered the living room. "Hot milk? You are a little too old for it, aren't you?" My uncle made a joke. "But don't elementary school children enjoy hot milk, Elaine?" I couldn't resist laughing along with them since their light-hearted conversation was so reassuring. They both started laughing, and their laughter led the way. My uncle remarked, "Sit down, I have something to discuss." He began talking while I sat in front of the steaming milk. "How about being our child, Elaine?" Abruptly, he made a proposal. I coughed and choked as I was going to sip my milk. "What?" I cried out in shock. "Oh, I'm really sorry. Isn't that unexpected?" With a pat on my back, my uncle remarked. When my aunt saw this, she burst out laughing. "How about becoming our child? Are you certain you want to return to your mother?" My aunt went on. Her remarks caused me to reflect carefully. I don't despise my mother, but the idea of going back to her is unsettling given the circumstances at home with my father and being abandoned. In fact, we had discussed this with your father, my uncle disclosed. What? I was even more shocked to hear my father's name. My aunt then went into great depth to explain everything. My father was aware that my mother had an affair with the man she was seeing. He worried about me a lot. My father wanted them to look after me after he passed away since he was in danger of dying, and his health was becoming worse. I sobbed when I heard this, and I missed my father terribly. My aunt caressed me tenderly and added, "Your father loved you very much and cared deeply for you." She has a soothing, warm touch. I kept saying thank you to my father in my head without speaking. I thought of my father, whom I adored and who always played with me. I made the decision that I wanted to get stronger going forward. They were thrilled when I informed them, "I want to stay with you, Aunt and Uncle. We need to go through formal procedures to become a family, and even though they will take some time to finish, I was told I could stay with them without any problems." I made the decision to assist with breakfast and supper preparation, as well as toilet and bathroom cleaning in the meantime, since I wanted to be helpful to my aunt and uncle. However, my efforts only appeared to cause my aunt and uncle additional anxiety. They added, "Elementary school children should be playing more," and despite my confusion, I began my schoolwork. "Have you been cleaning the home all this time, Elaine?" At supper, my aunt questioned me. My uncle, who was seated behind me, gave me a tender embrace after I nodded and remarked, "It must have been difficult to be just a grade schooler." While elementary school kids may assist with household tasks, I'm concerned that you may be going overboard. It's possible that I was unconsciously striving too hard to get my mother's approval. When I realized this, my mother's admiration that I never got, I went quiet. I thought she might not have appreciated my efforts. There is nothing to be concerned about here. You can lend a hand, but your friends, your studies, and your own well-being come first. My aunt's comments, "We want you to cherish yourself," struck a deep chord with me. My uncle's eyes were wet as he nodded repeatedly. Being around my aunt and uncle made me feel really joyful. I was summoned to the teacher's room at school 2 weeks following the loss of my father. I asked what it was about and was informed that my mother had called. The instructor shouldn't be too aware of my predicament. I picked up the telephone with shaking hands, fearing that the teachers may become agitated if I left the phone call unattended. "Hey?" My mother's voice, which I hadn't heard in a while, was yelling, "Elaine, answer the phone quickly. Where are you at the moment? The institution told me you weren't there when I phoned." I was unable to reply because I choked. "Are you paying attention to me?" "Never worries. I'm coming to collect you because I'll receive the money right now and the allowance I need after that," my mother responded. Her remarks caused me to quickly restore my calm. It was hard and irritating to consider wanting to be liked or admired by someone who had deceived my father. My aunt and uncle are by my side now, and I cherish them. Somewhere, too, my dear father is keeping watch over me. I can get stronger. My mother is no longer with me. Before I knew it, my mother had been the target of those remarks. "What? What are you discussing?" my mom shot back. "Are you wrong? Then goodbye." "Hold on." I hung up the phone before my mother could say anything further. "Was that really not your mother?" the surprised instructor inquired. "That was a stranger," I said in response. The school issued a warning after considering the call questionable. I called my aunt on the school's public phone as I was leaving because I was afraid my mother may arrive. After promising to come and pick me up immediately, my aunt did just that. Following her explanation of the circumstances, the school instructors made the decision to get in touch with Child Protective Services. My mother did come to get me up when I got home, but she was upset and left after the instructors handled it. My aunt or uncle began bringing me up after school, even though my mother didn't bother the school again since she was worried about my safety. Although I appreciated my aunt and uncle's consolation, they happily told me not to worry. I have been able to live a happy life thanks to my aunt and uncle. I feel supported by a lot of people, and the teachers at school are nice. The house phone rang one day. I've been taking more calls at my aunt's place lately. I joyfully answered the phone as usual, saying hello, but the voice that replied was one I did not want to hear. "Oh, isn't this Elaine? I thought you weren't at the facility, but you are there after all." I was shocked when I heard my mother's voice. How was she aware of my presence? I had kept it a secret. My mother went on, "Stop staying there and come back soon. Things are tough over here," without consulting anybody else. She said that she was having financial difficulties and that her affair partner's business had gone bankrupt. My mother kept pleading over the phone, and even though I heard her intentions, all I could see was her financial reliance on me. She had previously indicated her poor financial status when she phoned the school by stating that she was having financial difficulties. As I said nothing, my mother's rage became louder as she yelled. My aunt abruptly grabbed the phone away from me. She was grinning when I turned around, but her face soon changed to one of rage. My mother said, "Just respond at least." "Are you even listening?" "I can hear you," my aunt said firmly. "It's enough." Over the phone, My mother's voice faded off. Throughout the confrontation, my heart was racing. How can you not be ashamed telling your daughter to come back for money? That's no joke. What do you think, Elaine? My aunt asked her. My mother said, It's none of your business. Elaine is my daughter. Give her back. Why did you leave your daughter in front of a facility then? Stop making convenient arguments, said my aunt. My mother said, I'll call the police. I'll accuse you of kidnapping. Go ahead, say that. We have evidence of all the terrible things you've done to Elaine. We can share that too. We actually welcome the police. It would resolve things faster, said my aunt. My mother yelled, What? And I felt bad, like I was making things worse. Just then, without my noticing, my uncle came back and gave me a soft shoulder pat. After that, my uncle held my hand and made me more hot milk, saying, It's okay. Leave it to us. This is a matter for adults to resolve. Elaine, you like hot milk, right? You drink it a lot. Yes, it was so delicious the first time I tried it. I just loved it, I said. My uncle grinned broadly when he heard this. My aunt eventually returned to the living room, seeing my anxious expression and ruffling my hair while she talked. What's with that face? There's nothing to worry about. We won't let her win. I thanked them as I was repairing my hair. I later assisted with preparing dinner. I discovered the joys of cleaning when living with my aunt and uncle. My mother called me again a few days later. Although my aunt and uncle had informed me that I was no longer needed to take her calls, I still wanted to be of assistance to them. Elaine, Mom is really in trouble. Help me. I've said this before, but I don't have a mother anymore. How can you be so cold? I raised you. Have you forgotten the fun days with Dad? My heart skipped a beat as my mother brought up Dad, but I was also filled with rage. I said, more loudly than I had anticipated, Yes, it was really fun when Dad was around, but only he was kind. You abandoned me. I was obviously relieved as I did so. I then boldly retorted what she had said. You are still my child, aren't you? I didn't abandon you. I just left you temporarily. You laughed and told me that children are a nuisance and to go to a facility. I can't think of someone like that as my mother. I was forced to say that. It's not my fault, but you abandoned me. Therefore, I have no mother. If I have a mother, it's my aunt. My father is my uncle and my dad in heaven. You're brainwashed. Just come back without complaining. I was crying and having a heated argument with my mother at the time. But somehow, I felt as though I had let go of everything I had been suppressing, and my heart felt lighter. Then at least tell them to let me live in their house. I can't even eat properly as it is. When I turned back, I saw my aunt and uncle standing there. No, I won't let you disturb my loved ones. I sensed a presence behind me. My aunt congratulated me and gave me a shoulder pat, adding, Well done. My uncle nodded in agreement, his eyes welling with sorrow. After then, my aunt answered the phone and carried on speaking with my mother. Oddly, she appeared content. My uncle told me how pleased he was that I referred to him as Dad. I felt comfortable about calling him that after hearing his words of appreciation, so I decided to keep going. My mother stopped contacting me after that. Maybe the help from my aunt and uncle was also a factor. My aunt gave me my first smartphone as a surprise sometime after I had started my new life. It was thrilling to get my first smartphone, and it made my life even more fun by enabling me to communicate with pals more often. In the middle of the long, quiet days, the landline at the house rang one strange day. The school had largely been calling my aunt and uncle on their cell phones since the mother crisis, and I typically used my new smartphone to talk to my pals. I answered the phone, wondering who it might be. In contrast to my cheerful tone, a languid voice said, "Hello, Hello, it's me. I initially thought it may be an incorrect number and didn't know who it was. I was going to end the call since I had learned at school not to speak to strangers on the phone. Wait, it's Mom. Have you forgotten? I paid closer attention now that she had brought it up, and sure enough, it was my mother's voice. At first, it was difficult to identify since it was notably weaker than previously. You're going to be in 6th grade soon, huh? There's no one here now. At those remarks, my mother began to cry. She talked in a strong voice as I was unsure of what to do next. The thing is, I'm in the hospital. I've gotten sick. I was thankful for all the wonderful memories my father had given me, rather than feeling sad when I thought of him. I remained mute while my mother begged for assistance with her care and medical bills. Say something. Why should I take care of a stranger like you? I won't pay your hospital bills, and I won't ask my aunt to either. Don't get too cocky. She was surprisingly vigorous for someone who said she was sick. I wasn't as upset to hear of my mother's sickness as I had been after my father died. Her comments no longer filled me with terror, and my affections for her had fully subsided. I just pitied her predicament. I knew I didn't want to grow up to be like my mother, but I never thought I could react to her with such coldness. Actually, I've received a new smartphone, and the home landline is hardly used, so it's going to be removed soon. This might really be our final goodbye. As I observed her distress, I said icily, "Don't end things this way." "Then give me your smartphone number." "I cannot do that. Isn't there anyone who will help me?" "There's no one to support me." "Then I'll make sure to contact someone who might look after you." My remarks made her voice brighten for a moment. Then I groaned to myself and hung up. After getting the hospital's name, I called my aunt right away. My aunt commended me for managing the problem independently when I told her about this encounter. "Can I ask you to handle any further contact?" I replied. My aunt accepted without hesitation and said she would find someone who could deal with the matter. After a few days, I became aware of the constant ringing of the home phone. I purposely didn't respond, figuring it was probably my mother. The house phone continued to ring that night well into the evening, even after my aunt and uncle had gone home. My aunt groaned and picked up the receiver when I told her the phone was still ringing. My mother, as anticipated, answered the phone, and she and my aunt got into a violent argument. My aunt adamantly refused to talk to me, despite my mother's constant demands. My mother was obviously furious that I had called her brother from the other end of the line. I had urged my aunt to get in touch with my mother's brother, my uncle, whom I recalled my mother detesting. Known for his obstinacy and strong moral convictions, my mother's brother would never put up with my mother's wrongdoing. He was enraged to hear from my aunt and vowed to arrive right away. After many years, the siblings' reunion ended badly, which fueled my mother's resentment of us. Normally composed, my uncle observed the situation getting out of control and asked my aunt to give him the phone. But as soon as he answered the phone, his face abruptly transformed. My aunt whispered to me, "When he's angry, he gets even scarier than me." "Enough. If you want to talk that much, I'll come myself. I'll make you apologize in front of Elaine, sick or not, it doesn't matter. Be prepared," my uncle yelled. My mother hung up, shocked by my uncle's rant. Oops, she hung up. As usual, my uncle was grinning as the call ended. It appears to be true that it might be terrifying for someone who is normally calm to get angry. My mother was then taken without her will to her brother's house. She was quickly released from the hospital once it was discovered that her sickness was not as severe as anticipated. My mother, who had originally planned a wealthy lifestyle with her boyfriend, was forced to live and work on her brother's farm. She detested agricultural labor, but was forced to comply with her brother's strict expectations. She started wearing used clothing that the villagers donated as she could no longer afford high-end brands. In the meantime, my aunt and uncle's adoption procedure was completed, and I was formally adopted as their kid. I had a great time laughing at the large party we had to celebrate. We found out, much to my surprise and gratitude, that a new brother or sister would be joining our family the next year. My desire to value what it means to be a family was reinforced by this experience.